That's us at 6 o'clock. We are still waiting for a few people to join us, but I think we'll just push on if that's okay. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. My name's Vanessa Martin. I'm curator at the West Highland Museum in Fort William. Thank you for joining us this evening. Just a few housekeeping things. We are recording this session and you will be emailed the recording afterwards. So please do, if you don't want to be seen on camera, just keep your video off. Also as well, just if we could just ask you to remain on mute as well, please, so we don't interrupt the speakers. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. And for those of people joining us on Facebook Live, I'll be keeping an eye on the comments there. So if you have any questions on Facebook Live, just to pop those into the chat there. Yeah, so without further ado, I'd like to thank a few thanks before we start. First of all, Ian Oliver, who's from the University of St Andrews Open Virtual Worlds team, who is coordinating the IT for us this evening. And also we have two speakers on this evening. We have Lorna Steele-McGinn, who is the Community Engagement Officer from the Highland Archive, and she is the creative force behind this exhibition that's now at the museum following the fish. The exhibition is going to be there at the museum until the 25th of April. So do, if you're in the area, do please come along and support it. As well as the original exhibition, it has been added to. So we have some items on loan to us from Malig Heritage Centre. We have a virtual reality experience on loan to us from Timespan Museum up in Helmsdale. And we've also got some great dolls with stories attached that have been created by Brora Heritage as well. So after Lorna has spoken a bit about the exhibition and the ideas behind it, we have researcher Meg Hyland joining us, and she'll be sharing her research about the role of music played in the lives of the herring gutters in the Scottish fishing industry. So welcome first, Lorna.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I'm just going to share my slides. Hopefully all will work smoothly. No reason to think that they should not. Excellent. Okay, so thank you very much for having me along to talk about this. I don't know that I've ever been called a creative force before, so I hope I can live up to that title. As Vanessa said, my name's Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. And I'm going to just do a quick overview of the archive service, just a one-slide overview, and then talk about how this project came about and what it is, what Follow the Fish is. So to start with a quick look at the Highland Archive Service, we run the archive collections on behalf of the Highland Council, on behalf of a whole range of private depositors, businesses, families, estates, and so on, relating to the whole of the Highland area. And we run that across 4 archive centres in Inverness, Fort William, Wick, and Portree. Our documents go back to the 1200s to the present day. We run a dedicated family history centre and also a conservation studio for repairing documents. We run a wide programme of events and open days and exhibitions throughout the year. And we also manage the Ambala Digital Archive from within our service, which you will hear more about from Meg Hyland as well. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the Highland Archive Service, in the last full year of stats, we had about 13,000 people in our buildings and about 2.5 million people using our collections online. So it's a big service and it does a lot of work both in person but also digitally, and that's important, as we'll see as we go on. So I've structured this, I'm just a very short talk that I'm doing, with how the idea came about for this project, how we then took that idea, what the vision was, what the aim, what the outputs, and so forth. And the idea for this project came from 3 things. It came from when we had to go away, this image that you can see here, which shows Wick Harbour at the height of the herring, and giving an idea of the scale of the industry at this point. You can see how many ships in the port. And then the other thing that really prompted my idea for this project was that map on the right-hand side. This is from within our Wick Heritage collections held at Nucleus, Nuclear and Caithness Archives. And it was just the very visual representation of all of those herring ports. I run a series of online talks called Learn with Lorna, where I speak about stories within our collections. And every time I spoke about anything connected to Caithness at all, it became apparent how much a part of everyday life the herring trade was. And you can see that from those images. And everything I talked about, whether it was the weather, whether it was the harbour, whether it was the church, whatever it was, the herring industry was playing a role in shaping Caithness communities. So when I tied that in to that map showing all of those other communities which had such a connection to the herring industry, I thought there must be something we could do with this. Is there a way we could partner with other archives? Is there a way we could partner with our other organisations around the coast to tell not just the Caithness part of the story, but other aspects? So that was where the idea came from. And the vision I had when I wanted to do it was to research and tell the stories of these 6,000 plus women who travelled around the British coast each year from about 1850 to 1950, very roughly, gutting and packing the herring catches, backbreaking, difficult work. And I thought, how can we pull out some of these stories and find out more about these people? The other thing I wanted to do was to partner with other archives, because usually what we do as heritage organisations is we might pair with a school or we might partner with a mental health organisation. It's very rare for us to just partner with other archives to tell a story that travels around the country. And I thought, we can tell our side of it. We can tell the story from Caithness's perspective of these women coming and then leaving. But who else could tell another angle of this story? And then the other aspect of it was to ask members of the public to contribute their stories, their photographs, their memories. The aim being that we would then broaden the collections that we held and also create a touring exhibition and an online exhibition. I wanted to keep the focus of Scotland and England in it, because I felt that these women who travelled around the country had a foot in Scotland and a foot in England, and I wanted to keep that right the way through. And so we started with our own collections, particularly at Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archive, but also across our High Life and Highland Council for centres. And then approached Tasglann and Eilean, the Hebridean Archives, because many of these women travelled from the Western Isles around the coast. And then Suffolk Archives and the Norfolk Record Office, because so many of these women, as they travelled around the coast, ended up in Lowestoft, Great Yarmouth, and various other of the East Anglian ports. The key one here to come in was this one, the funders. So we approached Lloyd's Register Foundation, who have a focus, of course, on maritime history, and they were delighted to support the project. And that was how we came up with Following the Fish, to start with our own collections, then looking at where the women came from and where they went to. And the way we went about the project was like this. We researched into our existing collections. That was undertaken by the staff and volunteers across the partner archives. We had visits to and conversations with other related places and collections. And we issued press releases to encourage contributions from members of the public. So the picture you can see on the left there, the lady with the dark hair on the right-hand side, that is Mandy. She is from Suffolk Archives. And that's 3 of her volunteers who worked on this project, researching in the Suffolk collections. And that's actually them on a trip to Lowestoft Maritime Museum, they invited them along to come and see what they had in their collections. And the 2 pictures you can see on the right were given to us by members of the public to add in to this project. The resulting content, both from within our own collections, but also from this newly gathered material, fed into the creation of 2 identical 8-banner exhibitions. So one is touring around the Highlands and Islands at the moment, and one is touring around the east coast of England. And then also an online exhibition, because we were conscious that there would be people who would be really interested in this subject who might not be able to visit one of the venues in person. One of the things that came out really strongly, both within our research within existing collections and within the new material that was gathered, was there was a lot about the hard work that these women undertook, but also a huge amount about the fact that singing was important to them, that knitting was important to them. Those kind of crafting, social activities, community activities were absolutely vital. And that's why it's so lovely to be doing this talk alongside Meg Hyland. The other thing that appears in both the online exhibition and the touring exhibition are recordings. So I felt it was very important that we could hear some of these women talking about their experiences and recording some of the songs. So you can hear that both on the exhibition, in person and online. We had 2 launches for the project. Again, you can see my determination to keep the England and Scotland theme going. We had a launch in Wick at the Caithness Archives, and we had a launch in Ipswich at the Suffolk Archives. And that was really lovely because, as I say, it's very rare for us to meet and work alongside other archivists that closely on a research project. So it was really nice for them to be able to come up to visit us and for us to go down. Both of these launches had people who had contributed came along to them. So on the left-hand side there, you can see a lovely brother and sister up in Caithness who told us the story of their mother, who was a herring girl. And on the right-hand side, you can see one of the volunteers who worked at the Suffolk Archives research side. And she said it was her favourite project she'd worked on because it allowed her to tell stories of women. Both of them launches also had something additional. So on the bottom left-hand side there, you can see that Wick Heritage supplied us with nameplates from ships, and there were knitted gansies and all sorts of things. And on the right-hand side there, that's a band called the Ship's Rations who came along to the launch in Ipswich singing sea shanties. Both launches had cake, absolutely vital at any kind of archive-themed event. Apparently, we did our launch first up in Wick, and apparently it put the pressure on for the Suffolk Archives. They immediately went to go and find cake for their launch too. After Itches, both the England and Scotland versions of the exhibition went out on tour, and they've toured constantly since we got this funding in 2024. So they have been so far from Mallaig to Leibster to Cromarty, Lowestoft. They've been in Whitby, Norwich, Brora, all over the place. And as you can see there, some venues have moved everything around to accommodate this exhibition. It's been squeezed into tiny spaces. It's been dotted about through buildings because they're so keen to tell this part of their community's story. And that's been really lovely for us. And the other thing that's happened is that every location who has hosted the exhibition, just as Vanessa was saying in her introduction, everyone has taken the opportunity to showcase related items from their own collections or to host relevant activities. So everywhere it goes, this exhibition is broader than it was when it started. So for instance, when it was in Cromarty, you can see there they put on a Fishy Dishy Day, which is a community fish barbecue. And there was all members of the community coming out, cooking herring and making stuffed herring toys and all sorts of things. The wee girl in the picture there is gutting felt herring. They had a competition to see who could do it most quickly. Brora Heritage created these beautiful dolls. Each one of the dolls has a tiny little book in its pocket, and that links to a full-size book that they've created with an imagined story of a herring girl. So you match them up. When it went to Lowestoft, it was shown in collaboration with a Gansey exhibition with local knitters. In Mallaig, they took the opportunity to pull out items from their collections which weren't usually on display. And in Leibster, it was accompanied by a photographic exhibition about women in the fishing industry. So that's been a really lovely side that I didn't expect. The feedback on this exhibition has been really lovely. So you can see here this comment, which is when you're running something like this is a gift of a comment that you wish people would say. Fascinating, educational and inspiring exhibition. The strengths and skills of the herring girl are celebrated here, and their fight to secure better paying conditions. We had people commenting who said, my parents were, so my paternal grandmother was a herring girl and followed the herring as far as Lowestoft, where she met my grandfather, a cooper by trade. So many people whose families were built on this industry. And a lot of comments about the fact that this was a chance to see a woman-led exhibition. You can see there when we put it up on our page Ambala, on Facebook, you can see there nearly 900 people reacting when it went live. And just to finish my final slide, the future for this exhibition, as Vanessa said, it's going to be in West Highland Museum for the next couple of months. Then exhibition continuing to tour throughout 2026. So they'll be in Benbecula, they'll be in Lewis, they'll be in Woodbridge. They're going all over the place. And also just two final things to touch on. We think we're going to be taking part in a herring festival in Tanara. And just signed up this week, we're going to be taking the exhibition to St Mary at Hill, which is the parish church for Billingsgate in the City of London. And that's lovely for various reasons. It's lovely for me because I have a family connection to that church, which is very nice. But also because they're the parish church for Billingsgate, they host a fish festival every year where they work alongside the fishmongers who worked at Billingsgate Fish Market. And so although for them it's the start of those fish going out on their journey, for us it's the end point of those fish having literally been through the hands of all these women and ending up in London in the fish markets. So it'll be really lovely to take the exhibition there. So that's where we're heading next. But I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Meg, who will be able to go into much more detail on certain aspects of the lives of the Herring Girls. But I hope that's given a bit of background about the project.
Well, thank you, Lorna. That was a wonderful introduction to the exhibition. I haven't gotten to see it myself yet, but I certainly want to. Thank you all for coming. Let me just get my PowerPoint going. Okay, so happy St. Patrick's Day if you celebrate. My name is Meg Hyland. I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh in Celtic and Scottish Studies. And my research is about the role of music in the lives of the herring gutters. And so it's going to be touching on a lot of themes that Lorna mentioned, and the exhibit really explores about the links between different places and how music was a way, when you look at the musical expression in the herring gutters, you can really see these connections between different cultures within Britain and Ireland and beyond. For example, the painting that's the background here is actually of a dance at the herring port in Iceland in the early 20th century. So music was a big part of the herring industry and of women's experience in it. So first I'll give you, oh wait, let me hide this because I'm sharing my screen. There we go. First I'll give you a little overview of the herring gutters for those of you who aren't familiar. For those of you who are, this will be, you'll know all this already, but the herring lassies, they're called in Gaelic Clown Nian and Scotin. In Scots, they're sometimes called the Gutton Quines, particularly in the Northeast. The map on the left is a map of the herring shoals in the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. And I really like this map because it shows kind of the area where the herring gutting was done in Britain and Ireland. So the season would have started in the west, sometimes going to Ireland, other times starting in the Hebrides around May. And then in the summer, they'd move up to Orkney and Shetland. And then in the late summer and through the autumn, they'd come down the East Coast. So going through the Northeast, Fife, all the way down to East Anglia at the end of the season in the winter, late autumn, winter. This work was done at a time when the herring industry was one of the main economic powerhouses in Scotland. And you saw women traveling to help in this work between the 1840s and then to the 1970s, after which curing herring into barrels was replaced by refrigeration and modern fish factories. Originally, women and girls would travel to cook for the fishermen. There's a great memoir of a herring gutter, The Diary of Christian Watt, and she talks about how when she was a little girl, she and the female family members would go to help support the men by cooking, but then eventually women took over the gutting, and Scotland adopted the Dutch cure for herring, which became known as the Scotch cure. And it was a technique of gutting and packing the herring into barrels with salt so that they'd be preserved. And Scottish herring was exported all over the world, to the Caribbean. Before the abolishment of slavery, it was actually a major source of food for enslaved people in the Caribbean. But it was also exported across Europe, particularly in the Baltic. And so it was a huge export business, and it relied on women who would pack and cure the fish. Men would catch the fish. These were very gendered jobs. And then when the fish were landed and, auctioned off, then immediately the curing companies would come in and the women would be gutting and packing the fish as quickly as possible. They were paid in piecework by the barrel, although they also received a form of payment called arles, which was their kind of signing on fee. So that gave them a bit more of a stable income than the fishermen, because they did get paid something, whether or not there were fish caught. Although obviously, if there weren't fish to gut, that wasn't much money at all. Women were typically they composed crews of 3, 2 gutters and 1 packer. At the very end of the period in the 60s and 70s, they tended to be crews of 6 or 7 working on the gutting machines. But for the vast majority of what we're talking about here, they were crews of 3. The women were employed by curers, and sometimes there could be tensions there. Women herring gutters were known for going on strike, for example, on behalf of their own wages and working condition, but oftentimes too on behalf of the fishermen, because the fishermen couldn't really go on strike, but the herring gutters, because they didn't, the fishermen owned a share in the boat, and it was a lot more financially at risk for them to go on strike. And the women could really bring production to a halt, because if they didn't gut the herring would rot and it would be worthless to all the curers. So they did have quite a bit of collective bargaining power. But still, they were, working very long, very hard hours. They'd often start at like 6 in the morning, and then how late they worked would just depend on when the fish were landed and how much there was. So there's reports of women sometimes working as late as 3 or 4 in the morning. So this could be pretty grueling work. They typically started work around the age of 14, which for much of the period was when you could legally leave school. Some girls would start a little earlier, traveling with their mothers over the summer to kind of learn the trade from them. And in Gaelic, there's actually a word, the queeler, is the word for a first-year herring gutter who was paid less, but less was expected of her too. So even though there was no formal apprenticeship system, there was a sense of learning the ropes, learning from mothers and older sisters and aunts and things like that. Women tended to stop gutting for a while when they got married, but it really depended on their individual family situation. Unfortunately, because boat crews were usually composed of families, when a ship was lost, that could lose you all the male breadwinners of a family at once. So besides the intense emotional burden of losing so many people in your family at once, women then had to step back in and often became gutters later in life if they were widows, or once their children had grown. So that's kind of an overview of who the herring gutters are. Oops, can we go ahead? It should work. Yeah, there we go. So since Lorna in her great talk was talking about all of the different archives that partnered together for this exhibit, following the fish, I thought it'd be good to take a moment to talk about some of the archives that I've done my research in for my PhD. So in the upper left, they don't have a logo, but the School of Scottish Studies archives. I back before COVID, it was open all the time, and so I spent like 3 months in there, like every day, as long as it was open. They have an incredible audio archive. Many of you might know that a lot of their audio archive is digitized on Topran Dualkish or the Kista Riches, but there's also a lot of stuff that's not able to be online, but they still have it digitized, so you can go into the reading room and listen. So that's been a really important resource for me because trying to foreground the women's own experiences is really important to my research, and oral history is one of the main ways of doing that. I also did a lot of oral history research in Shetland Museum and Archives. They have an incredible audio archive there. And again, I don't know if much of that at all is online. You can search the index online, but I went up to Shetland a couple of years ago and spent a month there in the archives. And they have a lot of radio interviews that were done with herring gutters in the 80s. So that's been a really important resource. The British Newspaper Archive has been incredible, finding newspaper references to the women singing and to their strikes in particular. When they were singing on strikes, newspapers are a really important source for that. Bucky District Fishing Heritage has some incredible interviews, again, mostly done in the 80s with older women who had been herring gutters or men who remembered hearing and working with the herring gutters. The Scottish Fisheries Museum, I'm based in Anstruther myself, so this has been my port of call for my research for like over 10 years now. I started off on this topic as a volunteer at the Fisheries Museum, and they have an incredible library with lots of published oral histories that can be a little hard to find. Culture Vannin and the Isle of Man Museum have, again, some great digitized oral history resources, and they're still actively collecting those. I went to the Isle of Man in 2022 and interviewed a couple of people who had worked in the kippering industry there. And in Shetland, I was able to interview a couple of herring gutters because, as I mentioned, in Shetland, the gutting went on until the 60s and 70s, which is later than in most other places. So that was really special. The Internet Archive has so many old books that, again, can be really hard to find print copies of. So definitely support them. British Pathé has some amazing old films of herring gutters. The National Trust for Scotland has a lot of their stuff up on Topran Dualkish, especially Canna House's archives of the fieldwork of John Lorne Campbell and Margaret Fay Shaw. That's been very helpful. The Roud Folk Index, hosted by the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library, and Steve Roud has been really helpful for my research. Some volunteers at Cominyachtri Nish really helped me out by sending me some amazing interview transcripts in Gaelic and English. So that was really special to work with some volunteers from there. Umbala, which, as Lorna mentioned, is run by the Highland Archives. There's some wonderful interview clips on there. There's this particular woman, Chrissy Smith. I saw that Lorna had a clip from her on the slide. She was a gutter and I think a kipperer, and she has some great clips on there of music hall songs that the herring gutters would sing. So I definitely recommend that. And then finally, the Herring Era Museum in Iceland, which I would love to visit. They have an incredible website. Excuse me. That painting that I had on the cover of the PowerPoint is from there, and they have a lot of interviews with herring gutters in Icelandic, which unfortunately I don't speak, but one day I think it would be amazing to do something collaborative with them. And every summer they put on like a big festival in Siglufjordur called like the Herring Adventure, and they have reenactors and some women, older women who did work as herring gutters in Iceland. They come out and sing and play the accordion and do gutting demonstrations. So I'd love to go to that one day. So that's kind of showing you the range of sort of archives and sources and volunteer organizations that I really rely on as a researcher to research this topic. So what is my topic? Well, like I said, it's music, so song and dance in particular, and what role that played in the lives of herring gutters. So first, my research during my master's was exclusively looking at Gaelic gutting songs, because this was a genre of Gaelic work song that I think was really overlooked by work song scholars working on Gaelic, because the first kind of Gaelic work song collections were done by people like Alexander Carmichael, his Carmina Gadelica, Francis Ptolemy, and they did their field work in the 1860s and 1870s, even though they published several decades after that. And they were mostly speaking to older people who wouldn't have probably done the herring gutting, because at that time it was relatively new. Young people, some directions. But then what I found in my research was that a lot of field workers collected gutting songs, but they weren't as interested in them because they saw the herring industry as this kind of lowland intrusion into the Hebrides. And so they were more interested in what they saw as more traditional stuff like walking songs and rowing songs. So I found that these songs kind of fell through the cracks a little bit, but there's actually quite a few of them that were collected. So the oldest examples that I've been able to find date to the 1880s. There's a wonderful, one of the most prolific contributors and tradition bearers to the School of Scottish Studies archives is Nan McKinnon. And her mother was a herring gutter who gutted in the 1880s before she got married in 1890. And Nan learned two gutting songs from her mother. I'll play one of them for you on a later slide. And so those are our oldest examples of Gaelic gutting songs. And all Gaelic gutting songs are pretty much Porth Stabíl, which is Gaelic mouth music, which was traditionally sung to accompany dancing. And because the gutting was done so quickly, dance song was really the best accompaniment for it. So herring gutters could gut between 30 and 60 fish a minute. So even up to one fish a second. So most, when you think of Gaelic work songs, a lot of the ones we think of are walking songs or rowing songs, which are slower because the work is slower. But for gutting, you wanted to sing a quick song. And the dancing songs also really fit the environment because the herring gutters would also host ceilidhs in the huts that their employers would build for them. I'll talk about that more on the next slide. But so dance was a really important part of the social life of the women. And so they were singing these dance songs to accompany the dancing, and then they'd also sing them while working. So there's a real fluidity there. So what they typically are is love song formulas, where singers would improvise by swapping out the names of different fishermen and different place names in order to kind of pair off people. And when you consider that a lot of these women were actually teenage girls, it's not too surprising that that's the kind of thing they were doing. And as Lorna mentioned, a lot of people's families actually were formed by connections of people meeting through the herring gutting. So, these herring gutters, a lot of them were leaving their home community for the first time. If they were from like a little village in Lewis, they might not have left the island before they became herring gutters. And now they were traveling all over and getting to meet young men who were fishermen and coopers. They worked really closely with as well, who were making the barrels. The coopers would work with the women on the yard a lot. And so you have so many stories. I mean, I spoke to a woman in Shetland called Eilean Fullerton, and she's part of the Borough Historical Society, and she and the society put together a whole binder of wedding photographs just of people who met through the herring gutting because they were so interested in exploring that part of the island's history. So this music, these kind of courtship songs were a really important part of that. They'd kind of substitute in the names of each other's boyfriends and tease them and sing about the different boats that their boyfriends were on and things like that. So you'd have a set formula, but then you get so many different variants. And a lot of the songs came from Lewis originally, and gutters from other places will say in interviews like Nan McKinnon will say, my mother learned these songs from the Lewis girls at the gutting. And so you'll have women from all over the Hebrides who know that these are Lewis songs because they're full of Lewis place names, but they would travel all over. They can often be pretty bawdy. I'm a Gaelic learner, and so some of the kind of crude references have gone over my head. And after I've played a song at a talk, someone will say to me, "That was a really dirty song." So I'm learning the kind of allusions and things like that. But yeah, they were often pretty funny, rowdy, fast-paced. But they also would express the women's economic aspirations. They sang a lot about housing. I'll talk about that on one of the next slides. Linguistically, they're also very interesting because they're singing in Gaelic. These are native Gaelic speakers, but they're in an industry where they're learning a lot of Scots and English. I mean, they would have had English in school, but I remember reading one woman saying, "There's nothing like being in Yarmouth and not knowing how to ask to buy soap that makes you learn English." It's a lot more pressing than a school lesson. So what you get in these songs is you'll have bits of English and Scots, particularly words related to the fishing industry, mixed in with the Gaelic. So there's a lot of code switching. And I wanted to play you this one example from Peggy McRae. She was from South Uist. And unlike a lot of these, this is really easy to date because she only worked as a herring gutter for one summer in 1922. She went up to Shetland and she learned this gutting song. And it's interesting, you'll see in the title, it's called Tam O'Shanter Skenzie Sna. And a tam o'shanter is a hat, as you probably know, but the Gaelic word for it is Bonnet Crine. Bonnet Crine is Skenzie Sna. And you get both versions. So here they're using a Scots word where there was a Gaelic word. It's not like it was something from the fishing industry they didn't have a word for. So it really shows you that the women were becoming bi or even trilingual. So I just wanted to play you Peggy McRae singing Tam O'Shanter Skenzie Sna. And if you listen to the vocable chorus, it sounds a lot kind of like Scots style diddling more so than like a walking song chorus. So let's just get that up.
You would loaded lady, oh, dum, dooded loaded lady, oh, dum, dooded loaded the lady, oh, the doody, oh, sound like a mean of a lad, sound like a mean of a lad, sound like a mean of a lad, Christian £5 rice, you will lower the lady, you will lower the lady, oh, dum, do the lady, oh, the doody, oh. You molded Panel Malan and Nana, Panel Malan and Nana, Panel Malan and Nana, never off its means, you will lower the lady, you will lower the lady, dum, do the lady, the daddy, Kula setter Miss Malloy, Kula setter Miss Malloy, Kula setter Miss Malloy, a quarter Miss Mouse, you are low the lady, you are low the lady, dum the lady, the daddy, Oh, it's can get me court, it's can get me court, it's can get me court, can I like sound, you know the lady, the dodo lady, the lady, the dowdy, the Lord.
So that gives you a sense, oops, here we go, of what these songs were like. So that's Peggy McRae singing Tam O'Shanter Skenzie Sna. And that's the most common gutting song formula. You get so many versions of it. Anne Lorne Gillies said in Songs of Gaelic Scotland that she's heard it adapted to be about a Glasgow policeman sung at a ceilidh in Glasgow. So these are very adaptable songs. So this shows you what the gutters accommodation was like. These are huts. The first one on the left is in Shetland, and the one on the right is in Stromness. You can see there's a real contrast between the exterior and the interior because these were quite basic huts that the curers were obliged to build for the women. And this was in places like Shetland and Orkney, whereas when they worked in England, they would stay in like landladies' accommodations. But in the Northern Isles in particular, they would stay in these huts. And the women took great care in trying to make the huts as nice and homey on the inside as possible. So even though, as you can see, the exterior conditions were not always that great, they would bring wallpaper and they would put up pictures from home. Later in the 60s and 70s, they would often cut up pictures of their favorite pop stars or celebrities from magazines and put them up on the walls. And so the women always made a lot of effort to keep their living spaces clean, because the working conditions they were in, it was very easy for disease to spread and for pests to spread. And the women really went above and beyond trying to stop that from happening because they cared so much about keeping their living space clean. And they would also host dances in these huts. And they would invite on Saturday nights, because there was no fishing on Sunday. They would invite their friends, the fishermen, coopers. If sometimes it would be more familial, like, oh, my brother and father, like, invite them all. We'll have tea and then sing some hymns and have a dance. Other times it was a little more raucous, a little more romantic with courtship happening. And a lot of people will say, like, oh, I met my future husband, it was at a dance in one of the huts in Shetland. They'd also have dances in Shetland at the end of the season. It was called a foy, and that would be for all of the people who worked for a particular curer. So the curing companies would host them in these big like barrel sheds. And so there was a lot of socializing, which was really important because the work was so hard, but then the women would look forward. They'd say sometimes, like, looking forward to Saturday night is what got me through being up till 2 a.m. the night before over the Farland, which is where the Farland is what would hold the fish. That's what they would gut over. So this song I have here is Nan McKinnon singing one of her mother's songs. And this one's really interesting because it actually references the huts. So if you listen carefully, she's going to say that they're dancing Ans Natayan Alex Stephen in the houses of Alexander Stephen. And Alexander and Stevens and Sons was a curing company. So she's talking about how they're going to be dancing in their huts. And this is a song that goes back to the 1880s. Her mother would have learned it. So if you've got Gaelic, you may have noticed in the second verse, which I've got here in the box, she's talking about her sweetheart building a new house for her. And this is actually a really common motif. Remember, I mentioned the women's economic aspirations in the Gaelic songs? This is a really common lyrical motif in the gutting songs. They're love songs, but they also often sing about how they're expecting their sweetheart to build a nice taigal or white house for them. And this is really interesting because the transition from the Black House to the White House is one of the biggest architectural changes that happened in the Hebrides in the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. The Black House is traditional. I mean, they were building them in the Hebrides for hundreds, if not thousands of years, because they're really good for keeping the elements out. But as the women were traveling and leaving their homes in the Hebrides, they were seeing different architectural styles and seeing that it wasn't just the minister who got to have a nice big house in these places, that people like themselves were living in what they saw as more modern housing. And so you'll get lyrics about how, like in this example, as we heard Nan McKinnon sing, there's going to be a wooden floor and there's going to be stairs. We get women singing about windows and running water. There's some kind of comical songs about the lack of privacy in the Black House. So Herring Gutters will sing, I don't want a thatched house, because when my lover and I are trying to figure out, like, when we meet behind the peat stack, like, where are we going to meet up? And if they meet up in the Black House, the grandmother comes in, the dog comes in, like, there's no privacy. And so it's interesting seeing how in the Herring Gutter songs, you can see the women who were the ones who were then going to go home and push for this change. In Gaelic literature, which is traditionally more often like in kind of the 20th century revival of like Gaelic prose writing, you had a lot of male authors. And sometimes they'll write about like the pressure that the men felt, like, I've just come back from the war and my wife wants me to build her this nice new house, but like I'm having PTSD and don't know what to do about it. You get these kind of, Ian Morach, I think, had a story like that. And so it's really interesting seeing this other perspective in the women's lyrics about why they want these nice, what they see as better housing, because they said, we're going to have no disease. It's going to be clean. My lover won't get sick once we build a house like this. Now, far be it from me to say whether Black houses actually were any more or less healthy, but that was the women's perspective as they traveled through the herring gutting and saw different architectural styles. So that's a really interesting bit of information that is preserved in these song lyrics. So next I'll talk about Scots gutting songs. So as I mentioned, my master's was focused just on the Gaelic, but for my PhD, I've been really wanting to broaden that out. And like Lorna mentioned, I think the connection between Scotland and England, and also the different linguistic traditions within Scotland, is such an important and interesting part of this heritage, because you had women crossing these divides, these cultural and linguistic divides. And it's really interesting looking at the similarities and differences and how their song traditions influenced each other. So in Scots, we have a lot more genre variation than we find in the Gaelic gutting songs. Once again, our oldest example, dates back to the 1880s. I'll play you this clip. George Lordy Hay was interviewed by Hamish Henderson in 1952 and talked about when he was a little boy, he was 10 or 11, and so that puts this to 1888 or 1889. He was in Banff Harbor playing, and he heard the herring gutters singing The Ball of Kirriemoor. I'm not going to actually play the song for you tonight, because if you know anything about this song, it's not really suitable for polite company. But I will play you this clip of him telling Hamish Henderson about when he learned this song from the Gutters.
Do you mind who was it sang it?
Oh, could have been some of this. Well, I think myself, it was some of this here in Gutters. It used to gut fish down about the seaside about the Hebridean.
Why?
You saw some of that ladies, they didn't care what the song.
Sure they didn't.
Couldn't be too rough.
No.
Well, I think there's some of them, as far as I can mind, I think there's some of them that I heard.
You have been playing around the seashore.
Oh, just a youngster, aye. I would have been about 10 or 11-year-old about that thing.
So this is a really interesting clip. I love how he says they didn't care what they sang. They couldn't be too rough. They didn't care that little kids were overhearing them. Because the Ball of Kirriemoor is thought to date to the 1880s. So this is a really early circulation of the song. And when, this is a very blue song, basically about an orgy that took place allegedly in Currymore. And when scholars have talked about the circulation of it, it's usually attributed to soldiers and to male bothy workers. But George Lordy Hayes' account shows us that women workers were actually spreading it at the same time. So this shows you that, and the version that he sings, it seems that there's local women's names being put in. So they'll say like there was a quine from Peterhead at the ball, which is not normally part of the lyrics when you find it published elsewhere. So you can see that just like in the Gaelic, they were taking these kind of standard kind of body comic songs and inserting in the names of people they knew or localizing it to their own experience. This was actually less common than in Gaelic. This is one of the only examples I've actually found of that happening in Scots, but it shows us that even though they were singing in different languages, they were doing very similar things. Other genres of song, we find traditional or burns songs being sung by herring gutters. You might be familiar with the folk singer Isla Sinclair. Her mother, Zetta Sinclair, was a herring gutter, and she talks about how they would speed up the rhythm so that it would match the gutting better. Gutting was one of those things where you didn't have to be singing to coordinate the rhythm like you do in a sea shanty or a walking song, but it certainly helped. I mean, if you're doing a repetitive task for hours and you are coordinating it with other women, it did help to sing. So sometimes they would change the tempo and sing traditional songs much faster than usual. There were also a lot of women who sang hymns. If you're interested in that, Frances Wilkins at the University of Aberdeen has a great book about that called Singing the Gospel. There were huge evangelical revivals in fishing communities in the Northeast in particular, in the 1890s and then in 1921. 1921 was a really bad fishing year, and these evangelical revivals, she's written about how they just kind of swept through the communities, and you'd have people singing hymns while they were gutting, while they were going out to fish in the streets. So in some places, religious music was a really important part of their repertoire as well. Although sometimes women would sing hymns, they'll say in interviews, it's just because that's what everybody knew. And they wouldn't always distinguish that much between religious music and non-religious music. They just wanted to sing songs that everybody knew, because a really important reason they would sing during this work is because it was so difficult and they were trying to raise each other's spirits. So the more people singing, the better, because you're trying to build this feeling of camaraderie and community to get each other through these really difficult working conditions. There's this woman, Mary Bella Finley, who was from White Hills, who was a gutter in the 20s and 30s. And she said she says, I sometimes think we sang to stop ourselves from crying, which is such a powerful thing to say. And she says they would sing when they were gutting really late and it was getting dark, they would sing the folk song, my eyes are dim, I cannot see, I have not got my specs with me. So they would kind of pick songs that kind of humorously get them through, gutting at 2 in the morning when it's dark. And then another thing you see, especially as the 20th century goes on, is incorporation of repertoire from other genres and other places. So especially from the 1920s onward, there were a lot of Irish workers who would come over after the Great Depression started. And an interesting thing about that is that a lot of them were actually men, whereas in Scotland, it was considered pretty strictly women's work, and usually the only men doing it would be travelers, because it was harder for them to get what was seen as reputable men's work. Whereas the Irish workers coming over, they didn't care about that. So you'd actually have a lot of men coming over, and Irish women as well, and they would spread their music. So they would host dances in their own huts and attend dances in the Scottish workers' huts. So you'd have, people singing Danny Boy and stuff like that while they were gutting. And then you'd get a lot of popular music. So music hall was really popular from around the First World War through the 30s. I mentioned Chrissy Smith of Wick, who in the Umballa recording, Lorna was talking about the Umballa archive. She sings a bunch of really funny music halls songs. Like there's this one where she sings, I'm 94 this morning, I am 94 today. I'm not as young as I used to be. I'm getting old and gray, but my heart is young and I'm fond of fun and I'm very proud to say I'll maybe get married on Thursday, though I'm 94 today. And then she says, you know, when they were in their 20s, being 94 just felt unreal. And here she was as an older woman, not quite 94, but looking back on it and laughing. So I didn't manage to get that clip in the slideshow, but it's really fun hearing the music hall clips. And then in the kind of 40s and 50s, you got a lot more influence from American music. So country and western became so popular. And in Shetland, and other parts of rural Scotland, it's still really popular. So, you know, I was talking to a woman in Shetland, Sissy Goodlad. Her son, John Goodlad, has written a lot of books actually about the fishing industry in Shetland, if you want to check that out. But she was telling me that they would sing Burl Ives songs while they were gutting in the 50s. And then in the 60s and 70s, the gutting machines kind of took over. And the women I spoke to who worked on those said you couldn't really sing while working on the machine because it was too loud, but they would still have dances in the huts and they'd be dancing to rock and roll like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, all of that kind of stuff. There's a great story with Eilean Fullerton, who I mentioned. She's with the Borough Historical Society. She was a gutter in the 60s and 70s. And there was this time when they were waiting for the herring to get landed, and she and her friend ran into Paul and Linda McCartney, and they ran back to the huts to tell all the other girls, like, we saw Paul and Linda in Lerwick. And they all ran over Lerwick, and nobody believed them because they couldn't find them again. But then the next day it came out in the papers that they'd been visiting. So this shows you that I love the kind of range of genres you get here, like from the traditional Scots songs to the hymns and the music hall, all the way through to like 60s and 70s rock music. So it really makes sense because it was just, they were young women singing whatever young women were interested in.
Do you mind?
Just take a second. So on the left, this is Hamish Henderson's transcript of George Hayes singing the Ballacurry Moor. It's interesting. Like I said, I didn't include the whole song, but it's kind of a different melody than what's often included. And it's not quite as sexually explicit as some of the versions, which, you know, maybe that's because they actually were aware that there were 10-year-old boys playing and they didn't want to sing all of their verses. Maybe it's that women didn't sing as many explicit verses as the men. They preferred more kind of coded references. We don't really know because we only have George remembering being a little boy overhearing it. And then on the right here, I have, this is one of the, remember how I was saying with the Gaelic songs, they'd have kind of a formula and then they would switch in the different place names and different boys' names and stuff like that. Well, one of the only examples I found of that in a Scots song that's original to the fishing communities, unlike the Ballacurry Moor, is this one called the PD Drifters. I actually first heard a version of it here in Fife, which was instead of Div you see the PD Drifters, it was Div you see the KY's coming. And PD is the boat registration for Peterhead, whereas KY is for Kirkcaldy. So the Fife boats are Kirkcaldy. And I once spoke to a woman who said her mother knew a version of this about Shetland Burra boats in Shetland. And I learned the version I knew about the KY boats from a guy called Bill Motion, who was a longtime trustee of the Scottish Fisheries Museum here in Anstruther. And he remembered his mother singing this years later when the tune came on the radio. It was to the tune of Bon Accord, the dance tune. And how did it go? It was, Div you see the KY's coming, Div you see them coming new, Div you see the KY's coming with Bonnie Jockey Murray on the boo. And Jockey Murray was the then boyfriend of his mother's friend. And so she was teasing her friend by singing like, oh, like there's your boat coming with your boyfriend on it. And he said by the time his mother sang him this, Jockey Murray and the woman, I forget her name, had gotten married and were their neighbors in Celtic. So it shows you that these songs, most of the versions we have of the Gaelic ones, we just have these names in them, and we don't have the context of who these people were and whether they got together and what community they were part of. So that was really special when Bill Motion shared that with me, because it actually had the full context. And this version about Peterhead is the only one that has multiple verses that I've come across. And, they're talking about coming home from Yarmouth with all the gifts, because, of course, the herring gutters would spend a lot of their money that they had on gifts for everybody back home. So you'd get like porcelain saying like a gift from Yarmouth. You can find stuff like that in museums, but also like on eBay today. And so they're singing here about, they're getting sweeties. The Yarmouth Rock was a particular candy that people really liked to bring back for kids back home. And they're buying plates for the grandmother and carpets for the mother. So you can imagine when they see the boats coming back, they're all excited, like, oh, what gift are they going to have for me on it? So this is a really rare and cool example of a song like that. So yeah, just to conclude, that was kind of an overview of the different things I've been researching. There's more that I could have talked about. For example, I've just been writing for my thesis today about women singing on strike. Because as I mentioned, the herring gutters would go on strike and they would sing kind of change the lyrics of popular songs to make them like, we want a shilling a barrel, like when they wanted a raise. And they would also sing at fundraisers. So the women would, you'd get a lot of cuts on your fingers and it would be awful because you were salting fish. So if you got a cut, they would just get filled with salt and it was so painful. And so they would wrap bits of cloth around their fingers that they called ceilidhs to try to protect them. And there's accounts of them holding like ceilidh fundraisers that the women would sing at to raise more money for the dressings for their hands. They would do hymn singing. The missionaries didn't really like the women hosting dances in their huts. They thought there was too much temptation and that these naive Highland girls wouldn't know what they were doing. And I always just think if you could understand Gaelic and you knew what they were singing, they would not come across as naive to you. But nevertheless, there was a lot of interesting stuff going on. So I'm happy to answer questions about anything I've mentioned or anything I haven't mentioned. And I just want to end with these two beautiful paintings they were digitized by the Herring Museum in Iceland. And we don't have paintings like this of herring gutters music making in Scotland, but I think it would have been pretty similar. You can see in both of these men, there's a guy with an accordion. Accordion was really popular for accompanying dance in Scottish huts as well as the fiddle, particularly in Shetland. And the women hosting these dances, it was really key to fiddle players coming and learning the repertoire of men from other places. So the women were hosting these like multicultural gatherings that would spread this music all around. And in Iceland, you had kind of a similar thing because people would be coming from all different parts of rural Iceland to live for the summer in these herring ports. And so I just love these paintings showing people like gathered on the harbor dancing together. So anyway, I think that's it from me. So I'm happy to leave my screen up in case anybody wanted to see any of the other slides, but I think I'll hand it over to Vanessa now for the Q&A.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Meg, and to Lorna as well. That was really fascinating. I particularly found it interesting your mention of Alexander Carmichael because you might not even be aware, but we've actually got his main material culture collection at the museum. Yeah, I could tell from your face you didn't realise. So yeah, so the archives with the Edinburgh University Archive, which I'm sure you're aware of, and we were actually down visiting in November trying to match some of the objects from the archive into the collection. So we are actually doing a project at the moment with volunteers to try and better interpret those. But I found it fascinating that Carmichael just completely overlooked the herring girls because I guess he was just looking to the past rather than what was actually happening around him at the time. So yeah, that was interesting. But yeah, so I don't know. Oh, I can see there's a question. I hope there's a question in the chat. I shall just have a look. Oh no, it was a thank you for a lovely and fascinating talk. So, does anybody have any questions at all for Meg or Lorna? Or... Well, I'll crack on with one that I had. You mentioned that you're a Gaelic learner and you focused on Gaelic. How difficult was it for you to understand the songs just being a Gaelic learner? Did you rely on a translator or?
Yeah, so for a couple of some of them had transcripts in the School of Scottish Studies archives, so that always made it easier because if I'm Fachler Bake with me, I can get pretty far. But yeah, it definitely is a challenge listening to them. So for a couple, I got a grant from the McCaig Trust to pay Maggie Smith in Lewis. I had interviewed her in 2016 when I was doing a project with the museum because she did a lot of research about the Gaelic gutting songs for a play that she put on about the Gaelic speakers going to Yarmouth. And so when there were some songs that I just could not get through, I was able to get a grant to pay her to transcribe a couple of them for me. But other than that, yeah, it's a lot of transcripts and you do get used to and just getting feedback from other people too, like some of them had been transcribed by people speaking one dialect, but then you speak to someone like I remember I was talking to Margaret Lewis, who's Margaret Stewart from Lewis, the Gaelic singer, and she was saying like, oh no, Meg, like they've transcribed that word wrong in Scottish studies because she's from Barra and they pronounce it this way. And so, it's kind of a work in progress. And I just think the more that this material gets out there, it'd be great to get more perspectives on it because stuff like that happens where you realize something's been transcribed wrong. But yeah, I was starting to learn Gaelic before I started the project, but I'm definitely it's always a work in progress. So the transcripts definitely help when they're available.
No, that's good to know. There's a couple of questions actually just popped up in the chat. The first one's from Mary Mackenzie. Have you found any patterns of the dances have been written down anywhere?
Oh, that's a great question. Not in terms of like an actual diagram of like the blocking or anything, but they will name the dances. That's something that I haven't been looking at as much, but would be interesting if I had an endless thesis to look at because you do get for example, there's this dance in I forget the name. There are these islands in the Netherlands where herring was a big deal. And they had, the Frisian Islands. And there was a Dutch folklorist who found that they were dancing a reel pretty much. And he thought they probably had learned it from the fishermen and the herring gutters in Shetland. So again, I don't know that there are documentation of the exact steps, but you do get a lot of that kind of like reels and strathspeys and stuff, but then later you get more waltzes. Women would also in Yarmouth go ballroom dancing. And then in Shetland, they would learn a lot of modern dances from the American soldiers. So I don't actually, in one sense, I can't answer your question because the steps haven't been exactly documented, but there is record of sometimes the names of the different dances they were doing.
Okay, there's a few questions popping up on Facebook now as well, quite fast and furious actually. So there's Fran on Orkney is saying there wasn't much mention of Orkney where she lives. Is this because there's a lack of resources?
So Shetland definitely dominates in the record, but Orkney, you do find some interesting stuff about. There was that photo. Well, I won't go back, but the one of the interior of the gutting house, I think that was from Orkney, and on Papa Stronzy, you would have a lot of the dances in the huts and stuff, and they had a cinema that was built just for the herring gutters. And in the evenings when they weren't showing films, they would host dances in there too. So there's definitely Shetland dominated, Balta Sound and Lerwick in particular, but there was definitely stuff in Orkney. It looks like Lorna might have something to contribute to that too.
Yeah, I was going to say from our perspective, when we looked at which stories we were going to tell in the exhibition, obviously we had a limited pot of funding that we received from the funders. But also within our collections and nucleus, interestingly, given the proximity to Orkney, it was mostly the Western Isles that we saw represented of the women coming from Lewis and so on, coming up to Wick and then going down. And so because we were starting with our own collections, we used those people that we could see within the collections to link to the Western Isles and to link down to Suffolk and Norfolk. But I think if we had more funding than we did, and there's always possibility that we would do something further, that we would then look at including Orkney, Shetland, obviously Aberdeenshire, Peterhead. There are so many communities that we didn't include because we had a small amount of funding to do, and we started with, as I say, our own records.
Mm-hmm. And there's another question from Facebook actually as well, from Nina, asking about are there any books published about the songs, and if so, what are the earliest ones?
So they're, like I said, they're not really included in Gaelic song collections very often. Anne Gillies and Songs of Gaelic Scotland, which I think is from 2005, has one. There's this little book I actually have right here. It's not that easy to get. The Trials and Travails of the Scots Herring Girls. This came out of a conference that Jill DeFriends hosted in 2007. She did her PhD on the herring gutters. And there's a piece by Frances Wilkins in here about the herring gutters music. But like I said, the main book would be Frances Wilkins singing the gospel, and that's about the hymns. I have an article that's available for free online about the Gaelic gutting song, but there isn't a book about it. But again, these songs, they tend to, sometimes they'll be included in other books, like some of them were in Eilean Fruich, which was a collection of Lewis songs that first came out in 1938. And there's no like commentary with the songs, so it doesn't say like this is a herring gutter song. But once you know which ones are gutter songs, you can find them in there. So they do appear in other like I think one or two of them might be in Frances Tolmie because she includes Porch to Beal, but I can't quite remember if they're actually in her 105 songs of occupation in the Western Isles.
Have you got any plans to publish anything yourself at the end of your PhD?
I would
like
love
a book?
to do that once I finish. It's slow going because it's part-time and I keep having surgeries, which delays it even. But when it's done, I'll tell you.
Right, so I'll just stick with Facebook at the moment, but there are questions coming up on the chat here too. So there's a lady, she's asking, what inspired you to research this topic? That's from Sophie on Facebook.
So I moved to Scotland about 13 years ago. My parents got jobs at the University of St. Andrews, so we moved to Anstruther when I was 19. And I had to take a year off university because of the immigration stuff. And so I was like, oh, there's a fishing museum here in Anstruther. Like, I don't know anything about fishing, but I could learn. So I volunteered there. And when I came across references to the herring gutters singing while working, that just really captured my imagination. Because, you know, my view of Victorian women up to that point was very much about kind of the middle class, doesn't get her hands dirty. And so learning about these really independent working class women that I hadn't known about, and then that they were singing too, I was like, oh, this is so interesting. So I said to the curator, Linda Fitzpatrick, I was like, why don't you have more about this in the museum? She was like, well, if you research it, maybe I'll put it in the museum. So here we are.
That's great. Right, so we're back to the questions in the chat here now. So a question from Connie. Did the herring gutters ever sing about knitting in their songs?
Oh, great question. Because of course, one thing I didn't mention, but that Lorna mentioned was that knitting was super important to them, because they said it was a crime to be hand idle. So while they were waiting for the fish to land, they will always be knitting because they made all the clothing for their family. They don't sing about the act of knitting, but they do sing about the clothing. So like I mentioned, when Peggy McRae, I was playing her clip, Tam O'Shanter Skenzi Sna, that's about a warm woolen jumper that she's made for her lover or her sweetheart, and she'll know him because he's wearing the Gansey she made him. And so, or sometimes they'll sing like, I made this kind of socks for him, and like, I'll know him when he comes over the hill because he'll be wearing the socks I made him. So they sing about the clothing that they made for the men rather than like the knitting process, but the clothing, you can definitely see how important that was in their everyday life.
Mm-hmm. So I think the next question is actually for Lorna. It's from Elle. Are there any plans to bring the exhibition to the northeast of Scotland? Bucky? So
potentially. So I've had some approaches from Fife Council and from Murray Council as well. So that potentially will tour around Murray and Fife, but we're waiting to see what happens with that and firm up details if it goes ahead. But yeah, there's so many places, as I say, that it could go to, because so many of our coastal communities have a connection to it.
That's cool. There's some lovely comments in here that people's memories. Isabel talking about memories of going with her mum to the gutting yard. So yeah. So there's a question from Ian. From what you said, do the herring migrate up the west coast and then down the east coast?
Yeah, I think that's what they used to do. Overfishing has totally, and climate change have totally changed it all now. But yeah, it was totally directed by the migration of the herring themselves. So that's why they would always say following the fish, like in the exhibit. Yeah.
But yeah, no, there's some great comments in here if you two want to read them about people's memories of the fish. It's one from one of our volunteers here, Irvin, who's got memories from the 1960s and 70s. And
I'm reading them coming up on the side of
my... Yes, they're coming up. Yeah. I'm just trying to focus on the questions because I'm conscious of the fact we're running out of time. So another one from Elle. Was there any interface between the herring and salmon netting industries?
Oh, unfortunately I can't answer that question. I don't know if you can, Lorna.
You're just
we both did the same face. I was like, oh.
Yeah, great question.
We have a lot of records around the salmon as well, and different things within our collections, but I'm not aware of a particular overlap between the industries. But that's not to say there isn't one. I would need to go and investigate.
And one question at the end here. I hope this isn't too obvious a question from C Ward, but did they eat the herring themselves, I guess, or did they have different ways of eating it?
They did. They'd get pretty sick of it, but they would eat it.
Yeah, some of the memories that came up when we added to our collections of people sharing family memories and things, quite a lot of them were saying their mothers refused to eat it because the smell was so much associated with work and pain and tiredness. And also some memories around their mothers coming home with such greasy hands that the house would be greasy and everything would smell of the herring. And so, yeah, I think probably, like you say, they would eat it, but probably got a bit fed up with it.
It's freely available.
Yeah.
And another question from Facebook. Is there still an opportunity to contribute to the memories? I guess that's for you, Lorna.
Absolutely, please do. So what we've done across our archive centres is we've made a collection called Following the Fish, and we're adding in memories, photographs, stories into that. So absolutely, I'll put my email address in the chat. Please do get in touch with us.
Yeah, and if anyone misses that, get in touch with the museum and we can put you in touch with Lorna or Meg as well. So she's happy with that. I don't know. I think I've got all the questions because there were quite a lot and there were quite a lot of comments as well. But if I have missed anyone, please speak now. So no, well, that's great. I think we're running just a little over, but thank you very much, both of you. It's been a really fascinating talk. Thank you for everybody that's come along this evening, and for everybody that's donated to the museum as well. That's very much appreciated because we are in the middle of a big redevelopment campaign at the moment. It's not too late to donate. Just go to our website and hit the donate button if you can. But thank you for attending anyway, and thanks to Ian for sorting out the tech and being here at the university tonight as well. So I think that's all I need to say. Yeah, no, that's everything. I think just checking there were more just comments saying thank you on Facebook. There's lots of Facebook, but there's been as many people on Facebook as there has been watching it live, so that's good. So so thank you very much, More on Time.
Thank you very much indeed.
Right, bye everybody.